Welcome to the first day of the academic sessions of an international seminar on exploring the realm of the mental, cognition, emotion, and volition. For the first academic session, we have as our speakers Professor Sangeetha Menon, Professor and Head NIAS Consciousness Studies Program, Indian Institute of Science Campus, Bangalore, Professor Mark Siderits, who is the visiting scholar at Kyoto University, Japan, and Professor Ramesh Chandra Pradhan, formerly Professor of Philosophy, University of Hyderabad, Telangana. This session will be chaired by Professor Amita Chatterjee. I kindly request Professor Chatterjee and the speakers to come on the dais and commence the session, please.
Good morning. Our salutations to Sri Ramakrishna Paramhansha, Sri Ma, and Srimat Swami Vivekananda ji. We have started our exploration in the realm of the mental yesterday. This is an area where when we know more, we feel that we need to dig more deeply. Today, the charge of exploration has been kindly taken up by three extraordinary scholars, and they will look at the problems from different perspectives. And so, without much ado, I will invite the speakers immediately. But before I invite the first speaker, I would like to say one word about, time management. If we have total 100 minutes at our disposal, so if the speakers can kindly restrict their presentation at the most 25 minutes, then we can have discussion time for 25 minutes once again. And instead of taking up all the papers together, I'm thinking of having interaction at the end of each paper, since all of them will be presenting from different perspectives. Today, our first speaker is Professor Sangeetha Menon. And Sangeetha Menon is Professor and Head of the Consciousness Studies Program and the Dean of the School of Universities at National Institute of Advanced Studies, Bangalore. Her major area of research is philosophy of psychology, and her expertise is in Indian philosophy, consciousness studies, philosophy of psychology, philosophy and psychology of self, bio and neuroethics, and neurophilosophy. Dr. Menon's professional qualifications include degrees in biology and philosophy, and she has an extensive research background in psychology. She started her research with a comparative study of consciousness from the East and West perspectives, and focus on the theories of agency, emotion, freedom, self, and human well-being in the Bhagavad Gita. Subsequently, she focused on Indian philosophical concepts crisscrossing the walks of philosophers such as Shankaracharya, Abhinavagupta, Narayana Guru et al., and also bringing in Indian aesthetics and dramaturgy to understand cognitive dimensions of creative expressions and personal agency. One of her primary contributions in consciousness studies is in presenting and engaging with the concept of and experience of self from the neurobiological and philosophical point of view, and theorizing a self-challenged brain and brain-challenged self. Today, she is going to talk on being that knows and consciousness that is mindful. Over to you, Sangeetha.
Can I keep my book here? Excuse me. Can it possible to take it? निकलना है, रखना है, मेरे book रखना है ना। A moment of prayer to this very auspicious space dedicated to Sri Ramakrishna Paramahamsa, Swami Vivekananda and Mother Sharada. My pranam to Swami Tat Pradhananda for inviting me to this seminar, and my greetings to friend Professor Nirmalya for your kind invitation, and Amitadi for being here this morning. Good morning, all of you, and hope you're having a good morning, and looking forward to the different sessions this conference is going to give us in the next 3 days. Well, Amitati already said about the timing, so I'll be quite conscious about that. And we are starting at about 9:40, 10 minutes late or into the session. So I'll keep 20-25 minutes from there. My dear friends, last evening we had a very panoramic presentation by Jonathan Canary in a beautiful inaugural session. And there we saw how the human mind dances, holding the hands of poetry, philosophy, and an extensive sense of imagination. So I want to take you today to 2 to 3 scenes from the stage of antiquity, going back perhaps thousands, I don't know, maybe several thousands of years back. And let me not talk about the authorship of that particular stage, but that's one stage we all are familiar with. And we are quite familiar with the characters of that stage, which I'm going to present to you. Scene 1. A moment of monotony. The young boy witnessing something which is uncomfortable. Why is it uncomfortable? He sees there is an act of giving which is bereft of the piety of sharing. And why this moment of giving? Because all desires have been fulfilled in the mortal, earthly world, and now there's one desire left, And what is that one desire? Yes, for sure, the heavenly abode. And what is being done? A yajna called Vishwajit Yajna is being performed. All the priests are there. They're performing the yajna very beautifully. And now you know whom I'm talking about, but let me stick to that scene one. You see the young mind of Nachiketas and a very desirous and overwhelmed father, Gautama, who is a Vajashravas. Vajashravas is known to be, are known to be givers in terms of charity and gifts. So you see in scene one, Nachiketas, Gautama the father, belonging to the Vajashravas, he is a Vajashravas, and the priest performing the yajna of Vishwajit. The yajna is going on very well, and it's performed very well. Perhaps the yajna is a success. And you see, now the time has come for giving, thanking the priests who have done the Vishwajit yajna. So you see that Gautama, the father of Nachiketas, giving thanks to the priests. I hope you're visualizing. That's why I'm giving this gap in between words, because we need time to imagine things. I really hope you're imagining what I'm trying to share with you this beautiful morning. So Vajashravas, the Gautama, the Vajashravas, has now, after the completion of the yajna, is giving. And let me emphasize the word giving. After a few minutes, you see on that frame the young boy, Nachiketas, very uncomfortable, disturbed, yet with a smile of courage and a descent of silence, he comes to his father and asks, "Can you give me a way to these priests?" What prompted that question from Nachiketas? There's a beautiful description that the nature of the gifts was not of a very adulatory order. The cows were being given have eaten their last blade of grass, and they can't give you a drop of milk. It's absolutely beautiful with these two descriptions. Old age has been described, and death has been pointed. These cows have finished the so-called dharma, which is decided by the human species in their life, and now going to enter into the new world of death. So interestingly, death is first introduced through these cows who are presented to Nachiketas' mind. Nachiketas already has witnessed death on the faces of these hapless cows waiting there to be given one by one. And Nachiketas asks, "Whom are you giving to me? Or can you please give me to these priests?" It's interesting that you see a sense of self-worth in the young boy. Usually in a bureaucratic space of the yajna, is supposed to be not high in the power hierarchy, but much lower and supposed to be keeping quiet. But you see a person here who considers his worth to be very important, which means he has a huge sense of self-dignity, if I can say that. And he also understands that perhaps to give something which is nearing the death as a charity, as a gift to these priests who have performed the yajna to let his father go to heaven may not be so appropriate. And what is again interesting is to note that Nachiketas is ready to give himself, and he is ready to take the risk of being given away as a charity. So the scene 1 ends by his father saying, "I give you to death." And Nachiketas, the ageless mind of Nachiketas, yesterday we had a lot of discussion on what is mind. The ageless mind of Nachiketas, his intention was so pure, his focus was so pure that he was ready to go to the home of the forbidden, death himself. Scene 1 ends here, and scene 2. Scene 2, waiting. 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 The waiting is for 3 days. And we don't know, these 3 days is according to which timeline? The timeline of the god of death or the humble abode of the human being, in which case it will be very less. But if it is any other temporal scale, it could have been perhaps 100 years in the human measure, or maybe many more. But then it said the waiting was for 3 days. And the god of death comes, and he feels extremely bad that this ageless boy is waiting there since 3 days. And the god of death, usually I guess, is quite excited to collect the souls of the dead. But here, his excitement is pacified, he is silenced by the quiet presence of the being of Nachiketa. And I would like to introduce the being here in this context of Nachiketa waiting there for 3 days at the door of death. You and me waiting at the door of death. 3 days, imagine what will be going on for a second. How restless we would be, how restful we would be. We can decide and we can imagine what our minds will be. But here, the quiet being of Nachiketa, waiting at the door of death, Yama, for 3 days, and overwhelmed by this silence and quietude, the rich quietude of the being of Nachiketa. Yama grants him 3 boons. Here are my 3 boons. You can take these 3 as you wish. And the first boon is something very earthly and very touching, actually. Nachiketas asks, my father should not be angry with me when I go back to get back to my home, because actually I didn't take permission from him coming to see you. So please ensure that my father will be still loving to me and okay with me. The boon is granted. The second is to teach a particular ritual which will bring in well-being to the society, called Madhuvidya. And the Lord of Death agrees to that. And the third is, what happens after death? What exists after death? Is there anything at all after death? And that is when the very strategic Lord of Death comes and says, oh God, you should not be asking this question. Actually, I am waiting to gift you these bejeweled chariots, a lot of interesting people around you. They will give you a very good time here, and then you can go back to your father. So there's a lot of temptation which the Lord of Death gives of life, of a colorful life. And it's an irony that here is the Lord of Death giving you a temptation of a very rich, colorful life, beckoning you at your doorstep. Is Nachiketa tempted enough? Well, as I shared in the beginning, his being is pure and focused all the time. So he said, and you know that famous verse from the Upanishad, let all these jewels be with you. Perhaps you need them more than I. And it suits you, actually. Why don't you wear them and be around this beautiful company of the luring things which you just shared with me. So I think you will look good with all that. Let me be insisting on my question. What happens after death? What exists after death? Is there anything beyond death? And to whom are these questions asked? To the Lord of Death. Will the Lord of Death know what happens beyond death? Because if you take that question seriously, it's a conflicting question on the identity of death himself. Because he is death personified. Why would you want to think that there is something beyond death? Because death is all magnanimous and filling the stage in a megalomaniac sense, a huge form here. Why would you want to talk about something which is beyond death at all? Maybe there is nothing beyond death. But Yama enters into an exploration, and there's a discussion on the non-permanent, the disappearance of the non-permanent, and perhaps what exists beyond the permanent life, the so-called permanent life, and the so-called death, which is also permanent. Scene 3. And here is where I want to discuss with you some of the interesting facets of these conversations and two frames which I shared with you from the beautiful Kadhopanishad. And scene 3, we look at the personalities of these two people. I leave apart Gautama, the Vajashravas, though he is also a very interesting personality and as a metaphor portrays a lot, but due to lack of time, we will leave him for some other time and focus on the two characters, Nachiketas and Yama, the Lord of Death. Nachiketas is presented as the unaged and the selfless. He doesn't age. The being is unaged. The being has no age. And the being has no self. And I'm sure Professor Mark Siderits would be happy perhaps that I'm perhaps agreeing with him on this, but then there is a caveat there. Nachiketas, being selfless, was able to ask Yama the question of what happens beyond death. His desire to know the unknowable from the Lord of Death himself. And that is a very, very conflicting situation for both the parties involved. There is a being which could move on to becoming after listening to the Lord of Death, because you never know how the Lord of Death is going to respond to you. Perhaps Yama would respond to you by embracing you by those very hands of death, those dark, gnarling hands of death. You could be embraced. Then the questioner is not there, the question is not there, and perhaps an answer too is not there. But then Nachiketas has a being that shines, that knows. Knowledge is all about shining. And you know why I say this? Even if you look at some of this Vedic literature, knowledge is a phenomenon which also involves light. Many theories of knowledge actually involve the properties of light, of shining. Can being exist at the same time engaging in knowledge? Or in other sense, is the process of knowing contradicting the state of being? In the state of being, perhaps, no knowledge should happen, no knowing should happen, no knower should happen, right? That Tribhuti process which we all have learned in our Vedanta classes. But Nachiketas demonstrates that being is not in conflict with knowing when the intent is pure and when the exploration is to know something which is beyond oneself. And also, the knowledge which Nachiketas explores is in the context of the absolute existence of death. It is for sure that he is on a rendezvous with death himself. So there is the certainty of the presence of death as a permanent state there. And it's also infallible that you are having this conversation with death who will never leave you. At some point, you need to have a rendezvous with death. But what is interesting is, Nachiketas is faced or meets the Lord of Death, who is perhaps a changed person now. He perhaps is beyond life and death when he meets Nachiketas. His concepts of death itself might have changed. His concept of life must have changed. And he becomes a mindful entity, a compassionate entity. How can the Lord of Death be ever compassionate, right? Have you ever seen Lord of Death being compassionate? I don't have time to share this with you. But many a times we feel that death should not be coming to you now because that person was so young. Many a times we have felt, oh, only if death came to that person, he is so suffering. He has seen his life. So we have prayed or we have hoped that our friends and family at some point perhaps have the meeting with death because it's the right time to lessen suffering. But then we know that Yama never heeds to anyone's prayers. He has his own calendar. He has his own dates and time blocked, and his calendar never changes. Better than the Google calendar, never a mistake. And he goes to the person right in time, gets him, and comes back. His noose is never loose. And here is the Lord of Death, who is compassionate, granting Nachiketas not only a life, a colorful life, a loving life, going back to his parents, his father, and apart from that, two additional bonuses. One additional bonus of learning a ritual, and the third, to know the secret of defeating death himself. So what do you see? Yama himself concedes defeat. Because once you tell him how to go beyond death, you have defeated death. Then there is no death to Nachiketas. So the noose, at some point, at scene 2, moves away from the firm, dark hands of Lord Yama to the fragile, thin hands of Nachiketas. Who is holding the noose of death now? It is the young Nachiketas. Few more minutes. Yes, I think I'm watching my time. So once again, what I wanted to present to you today is these ideas of being and consciousness. Being as not in opposition with the process of knowledge, the act of knowing, the desire of knowing, the playfulness in knowing. Being is not in conflict with this. Because one of our ideas is that when we talk about being that is bereft of any flavors, a bland state perhaps, that's our mind imagines. And we, of course, can quote textual resources also, how everything have to be removed. And then what is left is this nice, pure white being, right? But then there's a lot of richness can be there in being, and that is what is demonstrated by Nachiketas. And he demonstrates that being is not a blind state of existence, but it has the capacity to cognize a million things and at the same time stay afresh and eternal. So the idea of eternity itself has been redefined by Nachiketas. In fact, we have to remember when we talk about eternity, it's not equivalent to saying that time stays still or the same at all times. No. It's just that the time which we are familiar with is not a dominant context or a framework which we have to always refer to. Yama, if you look at him, he goes beyond his own dharma and teaches the being of Nachiketa the secret of going beyond his own duty or his own reason for existence, which is to die. And he gives in for the unaging Nachiketas. And you can say that consciousness, when we talk about it, is something which we have to consider as beyond death and deathlessness. Our notions of body, our notions of embodiment, and our notions of considering the mind are very much anthropomorphic. And our ability to think beyond the limits of our own spatio-temporal frameworks is also less. It's a very interesting invitation from Kathopanishad, Nachiketas, and Yama to look at consciousness as having a compassionate mind, to include everything, and not just being an abstract entity which we have to learn from the textbooks. And Nachiketas as representing the being who is joyful, who is inclusive, brave, and ready to walk on this razor's edge without falling and see the truth on face. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sangeetha, for your wonderful interpretation of the immortal text, Kathopanishad, and showing us the relationship between embodiment and consciousness. And now the floor is open to questions. If any of you have any question, we can take a couple of questions.
Yes, please. It will be nice if I can get an introduction of who you are.
I'm Abhishek Bhomik. Good morning, madam. I am pursuing Masters in Anthropology. What I would like to ask you is that death has been personified throughout various cultures, like in the Greek Hellenistic culture, it has been represented as Lyra or Lita or Lisa. And even in the case of our Hindu culture, it has been given the form of Yama. So on the basis of virtues and vices, can one person defy the death? Or be the Lord of Death, be compassionate to him or her? Or is it because of the knowingness of what is beyond death, the things are equivalent? I mean to say that are both the cases same? That the virtues and vices of the life decide that what death should be, emancipating the person upon the compassionateness, or is it like the willingness to know that death can conquer what is beyond death?
I'm not sure Nachiketas ever had the desire to conquer death.
No,
I'm not, yeah.
I mean to say what the
if you have
context comes
completed
upon.
the question, then I will respond.
Yes, sir.
Please let me know. Thank you. I'm not sure Nachiketas was ever desirous of meeting death at all. And I'm not sure whether Nachiketas was filing a lot of returns from the virtues he had in life. No. His intention was very pure, which is to help his dad win that yajna called Vishwajit so that he can go to heaven. So here, we are not focusing on virtue, which is, I mean, it's an interesting idea, but then that is still to be, well, if you look at the hierarchy of human existence and possibilities of human existence, that is still in a social order, a social world. But here we are talking about the being of Nachiketas, which is full of light. So, but then as an anthropologist, maybe I should have another conversation with you after this seminar, that how do we understand death itself? And a lot of Aboriginal communities, marginal communities, take death as life itself, death as a new form of life. So it is not. So it is not ending of something, but it is the beginning of something. So yeah, so I think we need to consider this a bit more in a sophisticated manner when it comes to philosophy. But I guess an anthropologist, we need to have a conversation. Thank you. Yes,
we have
please.
time just for a pointed question. One.
Yes, please.
Actually, I'm Aditi,
Can I have an introduction? Yeah.
from West Bengal State University.
Your microphone.
From philosophy.
Hello, I'm from philosophy from West Bengal State University. I'm Aditi. Okay.
Hi.
Actually, it is not my cup of tea, but what I don't know whether I am right or wrong. Can we say that we can achieve that kind of consciousness that goes beyond by some kind of praxis, attitude, exercise?
I don't know about achievement, but I think there is a joy which will come by touching the surfaces of a being which is untouched by the usual limits of our life. If we have an open mind, if our intentions are pure and our focus is on to the spot, it's possible. Thank you. Sir? Yes, sir. I didn't hear the last part. Being and becoming? Yeah. To explain being and becoming? I hope I got him right. Well, that may take time, but then I will just, maybe in less than a minute, because I'm conscious of Amidadi glancing at me, you know, it's time for you to come and sit here. So I have to go soon and sit there. But thank you, sir, for that question. Being and becoming, these are a pair of a binary, which again shares a history of antiquity, not anything new. And the Greek philosophers talked about it, the Upanishadic philosophers talked about it, Chalmers talked about it, the AI thinkers now talk about it. There's possibility of something which is unchanging, and there is a possibility, not just a possibility, a reality of that unchanging going through layers of change every moment. But then, can the unchanging ever undergo change? I guess that is the caveat and the dilemma which we all face. How can the being become something which is becoming? How do we understand the becoming of being? And there are many, many ways of understanding this. Perhaps to relook at the formation of the binary itself. How has this binary itself come? Can our mind be a bit more imaginative to open a few more doors in the sphere where our mind is enclosed, and see perhaps there are other rays of knowledge formation which can be helping us to see reality in a different manner? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sangeetha.
Thank you. Namaste.
Wonderful sharing and provoking everybody. So now I request Professor Mark Siderits to present his paper. I know that Mark is well known to the community of scholars in Kolkata, but still I would introduce him because those who are meeting him for the first time will come to know of his scholarship. Mark Siderits retired from Seoul National University in 2012, having taught previously at Illinois State University. He now lectures occasionally at Kyoto University. His research interests lie in the intersection between classical Indian philosophy on the one hand and analytic metaphysics and philosophy of language on the other. Among his more recent publications are Personal Identity and Buddhist Philosophy, Empty Persons, 2015, How Things Are, An Introduction to Buddhist Metaphysics, 2021, and a collection of his papers on Buddhist philosophy, Studies in Buddhist Philosophy, was published by Oxford in 2016. I would request Mark to present his paper.
Yeah, once I get the PowerPoint up. No signal. Okay, sorry for the delay. Is this mic on? Just in case that's not on. Okay, can everyone hear me back there? Good. Okay, the topic of my talk today is subjectless consciousness in the Buddhist tradition. The question is, given Buddhist non-self, could consciousness be ultimately real, given Buddhist metaphysical scruples, given the kinds of considerations that Buddhists claim govern our ideas about what exists, what ultimately exists? Now, the issue here is involves a long-standing debate between the Buddhists and the Nyayikas, Mimamsakas as well, over whether the Buddhist theory of non-self, anatman, is actually conceptually coherent. It's too bad Arindam Chakrabarti is not here, because he and I have had a 30-year-long debate. He, of course, defending the Nyaya view, and I defending the Buddhist view. What I'm going to be doing today is suggesting that there is, in fact, a difficulty for Buddhist non-self accounting for the ultimate reality of consciousness, given the non-existence of a subject of consciousness. That would be music to Arindam's ears. It may be music to the ears of many in the audience here today, and for that matter on the days as well. But all is not necessarily lost for the Buddhist, as you'll see toward the end. I'm not going to give up on all defense of any aspect of Buddhist metaphysics. Now I'm going to go through the first set of slides, assuming I can actually, oh, yeah, maybe I should actually start the slideshow. Go through the first set of slides relatively quickly in interest of time. So there's time for Q&A at the end of my talk. Okay, Buddhist non-self. This is absolutely critical to the Buddhist soteriological project, because the Buddha understands existential suffering as coming from the mistaken view that there is a thing behind our sense of I, the ahankara. This is the soteriological motivation behind Buddhist non-self. It's central, absolutely central to the Buddhist project. You can't be a Buddhist without subscribing to non-self. Now, the Naiyayikas and Mimamsakas obviously disagree, and their disagreement often comes in the form of questions about the synthesis of cognition over time, how I can remember past cognitions, how I can connect my present perception with a certain past perception, etc., etc. How is that possible if there is not some one enduring subject of experience that had the earlier cognition and was also the subject of the present cognition? How can that be explained? And the Buddhist answer is basically one that appeals to this idea of the subject of consciousness, the I, the self, is in fact a conceptual construction built up out of bundling of impersonal, impermanent psychophysical elements. The skandhas, you get a group of skandhas, mind skandhas and body skandhas, together constituting what we call a person at one moment. They go out of existence, they cause others to exist in the next moment, and so on and so on and so on. You have this causal series, this causal chain of bundles of skandhas, of these impersonal, impermanent elements. And that's the standard Buddhist reductionist picture. An important part of that picture is the idea that this bundling is something that the mind imposes on the world. We do it because it's so much easier to have one word for all these many things than to have to discuss all of those individual things plus the causal connections that give rise to the illusion of impermanence. But that's just us superimposing on the world what are actually at root products of our cognitive limitations and our interests. We're interested in efficiency, in communicating rapidly, effectively. We are cognitively limited. There's only so much information our poor memory banks can hold at any given time. And so we use these shorthand devices, these algorithms we would call them today, in order to communicate, in order to think about and interact with the world. But that's just us imposing on the world stuff that's not there. We want our understanding of reality to be objective, not be colored by our cognitive limitations and our interests. And so all of that conceptual construction must be something that's, while understandable, nonetheless imposing illusions on reality. Okay, so that's the basic Buddhist view. And that's the view that is summarized in this notion of mereological nihilism. A mereological nihilist is someone who simply says there are no wholes made up of parts, there are just the parts. Okay, that's the basic idea. Now, coming out of all of this is the Svabhava criterion for what counts as really real, objectively, or ultimately real on the Buddhist view. The Svabhava criterion is, for a contemporary analytic philosopher, easily understood in terms of the loneliness test from David Lewis. Could this thing exist, given its nature, in the unaccompanied state, in the lonely state, with nothing else existing at that time? If so, then that shows that it's not the product of conceptual superimposition. Now, I want to use this in order to raise the following question. Could consciousness be something that's ultimately real? And I'm going to suggest that given the Svabhava criterion, there are some difficulties with the claim that it is. And the claim that consciousness is a dharma has the backing of the authority of the Buddha. The Buddha said so. It's one of the 5 skandhas that the Buddha mentioned, so it must be ultimately real because the Buddha knew everything, right? Well, maybe not. And then later, as the Buddha's teachings are developed in the Abhidharma schools, it's listed as a dharma. Now, if it's a dharma, that must mean it has an intrinsic nature. What is its intrinsic nature? Well, it would seem to be its intrinsic nature is to cognize, whatever that means. Now, there are 2 problems with that idea of cognizing as the intrinsic nature of cognition, of vijnana, or jnana, as NIAS would call it. The problems are, first, the problem of metacognition and the 2 forms thesis. This is going to get us into Dignaga and Dharmakirti. And the problem, which I'm going to call the problem of the implicit dative. The dative is, of course, the 4th case. Okay, first problem, metacognition. Metacognition is simply a fancy name for the fact that we are sometimes aware of our own cognitions. Not only do I cognize blue as I look at, well, there was blue on the screen before, now I'm just seeing black and white. Okay, so I cognize white, but I can stand back from that immediate perceptual experience and be aware of my cognizing of white. I can be aware not just of this external dharma, I can be aware of the occurrence of the cognition of that dharma. And how might that be possible? This gives rise to a long debate among the Buddha, the Bauta, the Nyayikas, and Mimamsakas over how metacognition is possible. Well, for someone who believes in a self, like the Nyayikas and Mimamsakas, it's no problem because the self is there to serve as subject of the 2 distinct cognitions. There's the immediate perceptual cognition of blue, and then there is a cognition of the cognition of blue, taking that first cognition as its object. And doesn't that require that there be something that is the subject of both of those cognitions? Well, that's not a problem for a self-theorist. For a Buddhist, however, it may pose a problem. Okay, and here's a quick account of why it's not a problem for someone like a Nyayika or a Mimamsaka. If we don't believe in a self, then there is no subject that can serve as the common locus of the initial perceptual cognition and the subsequent metacognition, the cognition of that cognition. Moreover, argues Dignaga, in order to try to solve that problem by appealing to memory, by saying, okay, first I had the perception, the visual cognition of blue, and then a moment later, after that first cognition went out of existence because, like everything else in the universe, it was momentary, I nonetheless am able to introspect and be aware of that cognition. Well, how does that work unless what I am doing is remembering the cognition of blue that I now claim I am cognizing? But we don't remember something that we didn't experience before, and so Dignaga says this is going to lead to an infinite regress. And so his response to the problem of metacognition without a self is to claim that every cognition cognizes not only its object, but also itself as a cognition. Svasamvedana, reflexive self-awareness, is the consequence, what Dignaga thinks a Bauta must say about in order to explain the possibility of metacognition. Every cognition must cognize, in addition to its object, itself. Now, this looks like a violation of the principle of irreflexivity. a fingertip can touch all sorts of things in the universe. It can even touch another fingertip, but there is one object in the universe that this fingertip cannot touch, namely itself. Try it, you're going to have a lot of trouble, unless you can somehow or other jump into a metaverse and get your meta whatever to touch your and whatever. I don't do metaverse stuff. Dignaga's response to that is the alleged counterexample of light. This will be familiar to many of you because many Vedantins use exactly the same idea to get around various problems with irreflexivity. Light illuminates its object, but also itself at the same time. Now, I happen to think there's a problem with that, but I won't go into that because that's not our topic. Now, where this leads Dignaga is what's called the two forms thesis. Every cognition has two forms, that of its object and that of itself as a cognition. It's arthakara and it's sakara. And the object form, and this reflects Dignaga's absorption of a representationalist view of perception. And one important difference between Dignaga and Naiyayikas and Mimamsakas, who were all direct realists, or so-called naive realists. And every cognition bears the form of its object. That's how I become aware of blue, by having a cognition that has the appearance, the shape, the form of blue. And that's what sense-object contact results in for a representationalist. But every cognition also has the form of a cognition, something that cognizes. Now, this should raise all sorts of red flags, given what I was saying earlier about the Svabhava criterion. This is attributing two distinct forms to what is supposedly an ultimately real entity, a cognition. How can that be? Won't work, okay? In other words, a cognition understood as something possessing these two distinct forms is something that is reducible by analysis. The mind can distinguish between this part and that part. And if you're a bundle theorist whose bundles are made up of tropes, then you have these two tropes, which are somehow or other bundled together under the name cognition. But the word cognition turns out to be just a convenient device for talking about those two distinct things. So that already suggests that there might be trouble here. Dignaga is aware of this. He's also, though, concerned about making cognition, the own form of cognition, the cognizing part of it, be all there is to a cognition, because that to him looks entirely too much like a self. An impermanent, in fact momentary self, but nonetheless a minimal self. And so he's reluctant to go down that route. So what Dignaga and Dharmakirti following him do is they punt. They say, well, actually Dignaga doesn't say this, it's Dharmakirti who says this, that our attributing these two distinct forms to cognition is just the result of beginningless ignorance. We have been reborn countless many times. In fact, there is no discernible beginning to rebirth. And so, since in each of these lives it turned out to be useful for us to think in terms of this subject-object duality, this dichotomy, we have that somehow or other ingrained into our genotype, and so we wind up imposing it. But it's all, of course, ignorance. Now, what that in turn leads to is, okay, if you say that this dichotomy, this attribution of two distinct forms to cognition, how much time? Okay. If you say that, then what you wind up with is this view that the illuminating of the object form is just the object form itself self-illuminating. And that really does sound incoherent. To say that is basically to say that being phenomenally blue and being what makes phenomenal blueness manifest are really one thing. Doesn't make sense. And there's a deeper issue, which Dignaga and Dharmakirti, to give them credit, actually do confront, which is that seems to, in essence, make the things that are supposedly ultimately real ineffable. They're anirvachaniya. And that, in turn, raises the specter of the paradox of ineffability. Because if you say that these phylakṣanas, these self-illuminating cognitions are really ineffable, then you said something about them. You effed what you say is ineffable. And that's a paradox. It doesn't make sense. Now, Dignaga and Dharmakirti did not actually address that issue. It's Madhyamikas who raised that issue for them. So that's the problem you run into if you follow the Dignaga-Dharmakirti line. The problem of the implicit dative stems from what in current work in philosophy of mind cognitive science calls a distinction between creature consciousness and state consciousness. What we've been talking about so far, cognitions, are what Dignaga would, these modern folk would call occurrences of state consciousness. Creature consciousness is easy. It's what we attribute to creatures like us or cows or whatever, but we don't attribute to trees and doorknobs, whereby we think of them as aware as sentient beings. But now what about state consciousness? Well, we need to distinguish those mental states that are conscious and those that are not. And Buddhists, at least some Buddhists, do agree that there are mental states that are not conscious. So what's the distinction? And the standard answer in contemporary talk is those mental states are conscious mental states of which the creature is conscious. Now, that's a problem because it involves the use of a subject of a state of consciousness in order to explain what state consciousness is, and a Buddhist non-self theorist couldn't say that. Now, what they will do is try to use the standard reductionist machinery to get around this. A conscious creature, that which has creature consciousness, is actually a causal series of impersonal, impermanent psychophysical elements, including occurrences of state consciousness. So at one level we have the subject, and at a deeper level, on the ultimate level, we have just occurrences of this state consciousness. That's how they would try to solve this problem. But now, suppose that we say it is ultimately real, then it must have a svabha, intrinsic nature. And what could that be? Answer? Well, if we avoid the representationalism Sakaravada that Dignaga and Dharmakirti embraced, what we're going to say is its svabhava is just its cognizing, it's illuminating. But now, illumination, what exactly does that mean? Well, representation is another way of saying, of characterizing state consciousness. And what does it mean to represent something, represent an object? Well, it means to give information to the subject. And that looks like something that could not be an intrinsic nature. If we're going to jump into the whole fray about phenomenal consciousness, about what it is like to be-ness, Nagel and Chalmers and all those people, then we're going to have to say that this what it is likeness that supposedly characterizes states of phenomenal consciousness is what it is like for some creature, for me. And that's bringing the self back in. That's bringing the subject of experience back in. So it's not clear to me in any event how it is that a Buddhist can maintain that consciousness is ultimately real if they're going to abide by their commitment to non-self. Now, what are the options at this point? Well, just abandon the Buddhist path, that's one option. Become a good card-carrying Naiyayic or Mimamsaka. I'm sure if Arindam were here, he would want me to go down that route, but no, not quite yet. Another option is to retain non-self and become a Madhyamika. Madhyamikas are global anti-realists. They say nothing is ultimately real, so of course consciousness is not ultimately real. You can still be a Bauddha without believing in the ultimate reality of dharmas, including physical dharmas as well as mental dharmas. So that's another option. But there's a third possibility, which is to reject the ultimate reality of consciousness. It's just a useful device. It has, in fact, our talk of consciousness, our attribution of mental states to ourselves and others has many uses. It's very convenient for us, but it's just a projection. It's just an illusion, a useful illusion, but it's an illusion. Become, in other words, a physicalist illusionist, someone who thinks that the mental reductively supervenes on the physical. Now, could a Buddhist say anything like that? Isn't that, in fact, walking into the warm embrace of Mara? Well, no, not necessarily. It might sound like this is what the Buddhist physicalist is saying. We should embrace our zombiehood, where zombies are understood as these unthinking creatures whose only desire is to bite you in the neck. Okay? It might sound like that is what would turn out to be the goal of Buddhist practice, but that's not right. No. Instead of thinking in terms of Hollywood zombies, think in terms of philosophers' zombies, which are creatures that are functionally, behaviorally just like us, except that there's nothing it is like for them to cognize. And on this kind of story, the Buddhist path is aimed at realizing our ultimate zombiehood. It was a mistake to suppose there is this thing called state consciousness and creature consciousness as just a useful device, and thereby becoming enlightened, overcoming suffering. Okay, so I'm just going to leave it at that. That's the option for a Buddhist. Which path you go down is entirely up to you. So, thank you.
Pandora's box and had brought out philosopher zombies.
I'm sorry.
So philosopher zombies have come out of a Pandora's box. So there are lots of problems, and I can see Professor Sen in the audience. Would you want to raise any question or interject? Okay. Teacher at university.
So, I think you pointed out quite a number of options which may be accepted. I think there is at least one theory which would be in between these two extremes, that either totally give up the Buddhist path in all its details, or become a Naiyayic or Mimamsaka or a Bhatta Mimamsaka. I think one school is not seriously studied. It is the Prabhakaras. And you see, they have been humorously described by Sriharsa as Buddha Bandhu, that they are good friends of the Buddhists. Now for them, well, they won't go down the entire Buddhist path. They are believers in permanent selves. And for them, cognitions are self-revealing, but not as objects. For them, every consciousness takes the form, I cognize so and so. And it reveals three things at the same time: itself, its substratum, the self, and the object, but not in the same manner. If I look at the sentence, I cognize so and so, I becomes the subject. The object revealed becomes the karma karaka, the accusative. And this verb, I am cognizing, or I am cognizant of, that represents the cognition. So they should not be confused. And there be a beautiful sentence, sangbit-taya eva sangveddate, na sangveddataya. That cognition is revealed, but not as an object. I think that opens up another alternative for us. And rather close to it is the Advaita position, where Swaprakashatva, or self-illumination, is described as aveddatte sati aparaksha vyavahara yogatva. That it is not a cognition, but yet one can have immediate apprehension of it, or one can, express it in this way. So that's just a remark.
Yeah, the path that I would be more happy to adopt is the Bhatta view, precisely because for the Bhatta. Now, I have to confess I'm not clear enough about the Prabhakara view about the status of cognition itself. For Kumarila, cognition is never in fact cognized. It's the object of artapati, an objective inference. I've always assumed that Prabhakara disagreed with the Bhatta about that. Now, if cognition is self-illuminating, it's not clear to me how the Prabhakara gets around the irreflexivity issue. Yeah, I know that he claims he does.
It is that I think the subtle point should be noted that if something is incapable of revealing itself, then it cannot reveal others.
Then it cannot be.
If X is incapable of revealing anything other than itself, if X is incapable of revealing itself, it cannot reveal something other than X. A penniless person cannot lend money to another person. That sort of argument, one can accept it or reject it, but I think this should be considered.
See, I thought
I don't say that this is the only option.
I had always thought that the self-illumination trope had been quite decisively dealt with by Nagarjuna. That illumination is not, light is not the sort of thing that can be illuminated. In order to say it can be illuminated, it must be something that can exist in the dark. So this notion of self-illumination in Swaprakash simply makes no sense. It sounds sensible on the surface, but in fact there's a deep, fundamental conceptual incoherence in the very idea. That's how I've always thought about it, and that's why I've been reluctant to look into the Prabhakara view more closely. But maybe you're right, there is something I need to pay attention to there.
So this debate has been going on for more than 2,500 years, and so we cannot solve it today. I'm sorry, I will have to, cut short this session because we have Professor Pradhan waiting. Professor Pradhan was professor from Department of Philosophy, University of Hyderabad, and he also taught philosophy at Utkal University, Bhubaneswar, and Karnataka University, Dharwad, before joining University of Hyderabad. His field of specialization includes philosophy of language, philosophy of mind, metaphysics, and the philosophy of Wittgenstein. He has published and edited books and contributed many papers to philosophy journals. His recent publications are Mind, Meaning, and World, A Transcendental Perspective, 2019, and Metaphysics of Consciousness, the Indian Vedantic Perspective, from Springer and IIAS 2020, and the Early Philosophy of Daya Krishna, Springer 2021. He has participated and presented papers in many international and national SEM conferences. That goes without saying, and I invite Professor Pradhan to deliver his lecture.
Thank you, Madam. Esteemed Chairperson, Professor Chatterjee, my esteemed fellow participants, fellow speakers on the dais, and my esteemed scholars in the audience, and ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I must express my deep gratitude to Swamiji, Swami Tadbratanandaji, and Professor Nirmalanaran Chakravarti for kindly inviting me to this August International Seminar. The topic of my talk is the primacy of consciousness beyond mind-body dualism. Though I have a long paper, I will not read it. I'll rather directly talk to you. The fact is that we are concerned with the realm of the mind, but before we really explore the realm of the mind, we must know the controversies that have arisen in the history of philosophy about the realm of mind itself. It was the great philosopher Descartes who made the mind-body distinction and mind-body dichotomy really, which has been the background of much of the discussion that goes on the nature of the realm of the mind in the contemporary times. What bothers me most is the fact that though Cartesian dualism has not survived because of the onslaught of the materialists or the physicalists of the contemporary times, though Descartes himself faced these objections in his own lifetime. In fact, his great disciple, the Prince Elizabeth of Bohemia, had raised this question to him, that how can an immaterial mind be ever interact with a material body or material universe? So that question, I think, Descartes had not answered. So that is the question that I am facing now in my paper, is if dualism doesn't survive, then what next? Does materialist monism solve the problem? That is the purvapaksh of my contention. And I will be arguing that perhaps if we raise the question of primacy of the mind and the primacy of consciousness, as the Advaitin thinkers of our of Indian philosophy have raised this question right from the Upanishads till today, and I take a clue from Advaita, non-dualism, not in the sense of taking any school attitude, but in the spirit of inquiry. If we take a non-dualistic approach to consciousness, what will be the possible solution? So mine is a hypothesis rather than a definite conclusion, in the sense that perhaps if we go back to consciousness, which Descartes didn't really mention, though by indirect way he mentioned consciousness, but consciousness has become the focus of our time, so we must really look at consciousness more seriously. And let us see how a dualistic approach to consciousness could provide a solution to the problem which contemporary philosophy of mind is struggling with. So let me talk about a little about the contention of the materialist monist, which is the Purvapaksh for me. That is what I want to critique, because unless we see the weaknesses of the materialistic monism, we cannot really provide any counterpoint from the non-dualistic point of view. Now, the first dogma of the physicalist monism is that the universe is physically closed. This is nothing but a dogma, maybe a hypothesis which can never be finally accepted. Let us see what are the reasons which the closure principle regarding the universe can be rejected. If it would have been true that the universe is physically closed, then much of what we call the forms of life and the mental realm itself, which we are concerned about, will be ruled out. In a physically closed universe, how can a physicalist accept anything called mental, unless he believes that the mental itself is physical, or the mental can be reduced to the physical? So the first dogma of the closure principle leads to the second dogma, the dogma of reductionism. That physicalists believe that everything that we call mental can be reduced to what they call physical. Now there are difficulties and there are enormous complexities in this reductionist program. First of all, they have to show how the mental realm itself can be converted into or can be reduced to the physical realm. For that, of course, they have to adopt the mechanism of various kinds. First of all, some of them can say, the identity theorists, that the physical and mental are the same. Or somebody can say that the mental is really realized in the physical. And if it is realized in the physical, then it has no existence of its own, except as it is realized in the physical. So this leads to the third dogma, that there is no self in this physicalist universe. How can there be a self, which is also a part of our metaphysical inquiry about ourselves, which really talks about the self and its agency and so on and so forth, with which is concerned the mental life of the individual human beings. If the physical is everything, if the physical universe can be really mechanistically mapped out, then the self will be non-existent. And perhaps the philosophers who believe that there is no self, like the Buddhist, will be very happy with this kind of conclusion. But the point of the matter is this, that who will be talking about this universe, that the universe is physically closed? There must be a thinker somewhere. So the Descartes is right. Unless there is a thinker, there is an I, or there is a self, who will be talking about this closed universe? So in a sense, the physicalism is self-defeating, and it has self-defeated itself. That's why reductive physicalism has been almost replaced by non-reductive physicalism, like John Searle and David Chalmers and Nagel and others. But can non-reductive physicalism solve the problem? For example, the hard problem of consciousness, which has been quite very popular in our discourse on philosophy of mind, has only raised the question but not solved it. The hard problem is mentioning that there is a subjectivity or there is a subjective consciousness, but there is no reason why a physicalist will accept that there is a subjective or there is a subject of consciousness. So in that sense also, I think non-reductivism can ultimately fall into the trap of reductivism. So these are my observations on what we may call the materialistic or physicalist monism. Now I'll look at the alternative that I am searching for. let us say that consciousness is itself absolutely real, and there is no reason why there should be any doubt that consciousness is not real. So Descartes must be kept in mind while we try to really deny the fact that there is a mental realm. Now, this mental realm, in the non-dualistic perspective, would be like this, that it is the consciousness which is the ultimate realm of reality, and that will be taken as absolutely real. Now, what does follow from ascribing an absolute character to consciousness? An Advaitian, by any persuasion, will be satisfied with the fact that in any sense, if we trace out the ultimate realm of reality, it cannot be the mental just, because the mental itself is a conscious realm. So the realm of the mental must lead us back to consciousness. And if we start with the physical body, where do we end really? From one physical body, we can go to the other physical body. In this sense, we can go endlessly in the chain of physical bodies. So the entire physical cosmos can be taken into account as a matter of our understanding. But if we understand the physical universe, then it also leads to the idea that there must be a conscious mind or conscious being who is really talking about this universe, who is trying to grasp the reality of this cosmic system. So in that sense, ultimately we are back to consciousness. So then an Advaitian or a non-dualist would be really happy to note that mind-body dualism itself has nothing very substantial to really reveal about the ultimate reality of the universe or the ultimate reality itself. So in that sense, I think the first dogma that the universe is physically closed can be challenged by the non-dualist, because even the idea of a closed universe, a physically structured universe, itself presupposes a conscious being or a conscious mind. So in that sense, we cannot really deny that there is a consciousness is ultimately real. Second point that I want to mention is this, that consciousness itself cannot be an individual consciousness which a non-dualist can accept. An individual consciousness is always a fraction of a universal consciousness. If consciousness is not universal, then what it could be? If it is my consciousness or your consciousness, then where does it lead to? Could there be a summation of our individual consciousness, and then we can really talk about a universal consciousness? That cannot be the case. A summation of consciousnesses will not make any sense. Therefore, we have to really logically accept or metaphysically accept that the consciousness itself is ultimately real, which is universal in nature. Now, can this universal consciousness be finite? If it is finite, then it will be again an individualized consciousness. Again, a consciousness which is confined to a particular body. So in that sense, it cannot also be the universal consciousness. Hence, we must accept that the consciousness must be infinite, and that is ananta, as it is said in the Vedantic discourse. It must be unlimited. We cannot think of a limit of consciousness. Any limited consciousness will be again individualized consciousness. The third point is that this consciousness cannot be a temporal consciousness. When we talk of consciousness in the temporal mode, again we are back to individualized consciousness, which is called the situated consciousness or embodied consciousness. But that cannot be the final truth about consciousness. If consciousness would have been a temporal one, then perhaps we can again be only confined to a limited consciousness, which is logically inconceivable. Because limited consciousness, which is temporal, itself must be understood metaphysically as infinite and as timeless. If it is not timeless, if consciousness is confined to a temporal series, then perhaps we will be falling back on the Hume's idea of a discrete consciousness or a Buddhist idea of discrete consciousness. But a discrete consciousness cannot help us at all, because we have a larger agenda of understanding the nature of consciousness itself. So how can it be a discrete consciousness? It must be a unified consciousness, as William James would have said rightly, that is a stream of consciousness. Of course, a stream may not be the right response to the Advaitic notion of a timeless consciousness. So in that sense, consciousness should be universal, infinite, and timeless. Now let us see what happens to the physical body itself, or the physical universe itself. Where does it go? How do you explain this physical universe? An Advaitin has the responsibility of understanding or explaining this physical universe. It can do this by this way, that consciousness, when it is absolutely real, it doesn't deny that there is a world. That is why we have in the literature itself suggested the idea of a Maya, the idea of, without going into the details of sexuality, I can just say that the world is there. It is real, practically real, but it is derivatively real. Now, it is not necessary to say that if consciousness is absolutely real, then everything else is finally got to be unreal. That is not the case. The universe itself is real, but it is derivably real. I can understand this universe only if I have consciousness as absolutely real. Because ultimately, for understanding this universe itself, I require a conscious mind. And that conscious mind cannot be me, you, or anybody. It must be a universal mind. Though it may look very ludicrous to contemporary thinkers that there is a universal mind, but that is logically so. Whether metaphysically we accept it or not, whether we empirically accept it or not, but metaphysically you have to accept it. Because a mind, unless there is a mind which is universal, how can somebody understand the universe itself? So if your metaphysics is talking about the universe, about the physical universe, then you must have a conscious universal mind. And that is logically so. So if this is the case, then we can understand that individual consciousness, or jiva as we say, as Vedanta itself suggests, we can understand very well that our consciousness cannot be different from the ultimate consciousness. Because my individualized consciousness, which is a situated consciousness, could not be what it is had there not been an absolute consciousness, and which is the pure consciousness, as we say in the Advaitic language. So in that sense, I think that if we take a non-dualist approach, some of these puzzles could be settled down for the reason that consciousness itself, as we all now realize, has to be accepted as real. So the mental realm that we are talking about is safe in the hands of those who talk about the absolute nature of consciousness. Perhaps it will take time for us to discover in our exploration of the mental world that there is also a supramental world. And that is perhaps waiting for us to realize, to understand, but that is not the immediate concern of our seminar. If there could be a post-seminar discussion on this, exploring the supramental world, perhaps that will be an accepted suggestion in the sense that Advaitin, who has already said that the consciousness is absolute, cannot but accept that the trans consciousness is really a transcendental consciousness, and that goes beyond our ordinary consciousnesses. If that goes beyond of our ordinary consciousness, then in that sense it has to be supramental. So in this sense, I conclude by suggesting that a non-dualistic hypothesis could be really take us away from some of the presuppositions which modern materialism has led us to. The materialism is not a sound doctrine that all of us we realize. At least this seminar is definitely an indirect condemnation of the idea that it is only the physical universe that matters and nothing else. It is the, as yesterday Swamiji said in the inaugural session, that this is the most important question, not one of the important questions, that there is a mental realm. And this realm is the one which all of us are really now very concerned about. And I think a non-dualistic approach to the approach to consciousness can solve some of the Cartesian issues and some of the issues raised by very well-meaning contemporary thinkers who will be referred to by many of our speakers. So with these words, I thank the audience. Thank you, everybody, for giving me this opportunity to speak on this occasion. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Professor Pradhan, for excellent time management and also, opening up the whole vista of the debate related to consciousness. And so we have time. We have at least 5 minutes, or if the organizers permit, we can extend it to 10 minutes. So please, yes.
Advaita view, universal mind, does it, can you elaborate on how that fits in into your framework of universal mind and the concept of Akashic records, which is accessed individually? These two.
Please repeat the question. Yet I could
Gaudapada's formulation of the universal mind working out this finitude of selves, and Akashic record as a universal mind which is accessed individually.
Yeah, exactly. I am making a distinction between the universal mind and the individual mind. That is, individual mind is perfectly intelligible because all our minds are individual minds. But a universal mind is taken to be the or universal consciousness, because in this sense I mean universal consciousness, because that follows logically and metaphysically, because unless you have a universal consciousness or a universal mind, you cannot talk about an individual mind. So for that reason, I don't have to give a space for it or an universal for a universal body. So universal mind is not necessarily in that sense embodied, whereas the individual mind is embodied. So this distinction we have to accept.
Yes.
Yes. Prashanta Rai, that's me. My career has been in the civil services, but I come from a physics background. Now, I'm sure many of us have heard about quantum mechanics, which is a cornerstone of modern physics. It has upset almost everything that the deterministic philosophy of physics, meaning science, said. Most critically, now physics accepts that when you observe a thing, you do not see only an object. The subject comes in absolutely, involved in it. So it is, an observation is not an objective phenomenon, pure and simple. It is a subject-object phenomenon. Philosophically, if subject is involved, how do we even know there is an object? So now, even the stalwarts of physics say that the mind is involved in observation. Some go to the extent of saying consciousness is involved in observation. So in future, physics cannot be taught without bringing in consciousness into the syllabus. That is as far as things might be going in future. Number two, Vivekananda once said, psychology is the science of sciences. He had a tremendously scientific mind. So physics, chemistry, these are okay, beautiful science. But the real science is psychology. What does it mean? Do not go objectifying things only. Come to yourself. Without that, you will know nothing. And I think, I'm not a student of Vedanta or anything, but I have interests there. I think there is a passage somewhere in the Upanishads which asks the beautiful question, how can the knower be known? The answer is, you can never know him. Therefore, you can never observe, see, find out consciousness. You can be conscious as you always are. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your kind observations. First of all, I must thank you for pointing out that physics itself is accepting that there is conscious observer, a conscious mind. Therefore, the first idea of the physical is that the universe is physically closed, is punctured by the quantum theorist. I think that is a really welcome development from the philosophical point of view, though I do not know much about quantum mechanics, but this much I know from your observation, that mind is also a necessary element in the understanding of the universe. So universe cannot be really physically closed. Second point, that about really I missed the second point. Psychology. Swamiji is really right that unless psychology is there, even understanding physics also will be impossible. So in that sense, Swamiji, our great Swamiji, is right in saying that psychology is the science of sciences. So I think we are realizing slowly the same truth, that unless we understand consciousness, which is a subject matter of psychology and also many other sciences, like neuroscience, that we are really realizing the fact that we have to go back to psychology to understand what consciousness is. So thank you for your kind observations.
We just have time for one or two pointed questions. Yes, Professor Sebastian, after.
Hello. Sir, you have talked about physical reductivism. Can we have a solution of this problem if we accept semantic reductionism proposed by Damit, that the statements regarding the mental states can be translated into statements regarding bodily states, but that does not require the mental states to be reduced to physical states, so the conscious being will still be real?
Yes, if you are agreeing that consciousness cannot be reduced or mental states cannot be reduced, I am happy with that. But the fact, I objected to the idea there is any reduction possible from mind to matter, that mind is to be reduced to matter, or consciousness has to be reduced to the brain states. I think that is impossible. First of all, that brain itself is a conscious organ. So consciousness is presupposed by the brain itself. Brain is not just what we call a dead matter. So if consciousness would have been the epitome of if brain would have been the source of consciousness, perhaps that will be going in a round, because consciousness is already presupposed by the brain. A non-conscious brain cannot cause consciousness. That should be understood by all of us. Anything that is unconscious cannot produce consciousness. That is logically impossible. So a conscious brain produces consciousness. That is tautologous. So in that sense, I'm right. If you are saying that consciousness cannot be reduced to the brain states, then I'm with you. Thank you very much.
Professor Sebastian.
Professor Pradhan, it's always a joy to listen to you. Intellectually stimulating. We were there in Benares on the other day. When you said about the Buddhists, the physical exposition, if we hold on, the Buddhists will be happier, you said. And I think you are uncharitable to the different schools of Buddhist thought. And among the Buddhist philosophical traditions, there is a school of thought which upholds only consciousness. Sarvakalam yatha bhavat saiva vishapti matrada, Vasubandhu's Vimshatika, one of the verse. Means what is existing there is only consciousness. And as you said, that consciousness is not a momentary consciousness. It's a vijnana sandhana. It's a stream of consciousness. Like jalanam tarangavat, consciousness goes on. And Buddhist position as such is not, quote unquote, the non-self position. We should know the trajectory of Buddhist trajectory, and I believe that Advaitins are borrowing much from the Yogacara Buddhism.
Okay, thank you, Professor Sebastian. You are a real Buddhist, and I have no really any contention with you. But my observation was regarding the concept of self. So if any Buddhist thinks there is no self, I think that will not be correct. Though Buddhist, I think we are not accepting self as a substance, a soul. But they never denied self. Because without self, who will be attaining nirvana? Nirvana cannot be in the air. It must be somebody's nirvana. So in that sense, I think self is very much safe within Buddhism. I also agree with the idea that there is a santana, there is the stream of consciousness. It is a continuous consciousness, and that I think that goes towards the Advaitic notion of consciousness as a universally continuous reality. It would be wrong to say that the Advaitic consciousness is static or jada. No, it is really dynamic, because the whole the world has to be understood in terms of a dynamic consciousness. So I think Yogacara comes very closer to Buddhism, closer to Advaita, if I am correct. I am not expert in either of the two, but this is my hunch, that if you accept the Yogacara position, then you are not very far away from Advaita, because ultimately we are talking about the ultimate reality, and that is consciousness. If that is the point of agreement, then I think Buddhist and Vedantins should agree. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks to all the speakers and also to the audience. And in the first session, we have covered a lot, starting with an ageless, timeless being. We have traversed to philosopher's zombie, and that's a physicalist perspective. And from there, we swung back to absolute consciousness of Advaita monism. I'm a bit sad because nobody has yet, taken the brief of the pluralists, but I hope that in other sessions we will have some proponents of pluralism too, along with consciousness. Thank you.